By the time Gloria Swanson and Joseph Kennedy called it quits, the movie business was infused with financiers and firmly bi-coastal. Production was in Hollywood, but the power of the purse was in New York. Moguls like Louis B. Mayer may not have had the final say on budgets, but Mayer had something the money men in New York didn't: a gut instinct for stories and star appeal. While in Europe to rescue Ben-Hur and return it to Hollywood, Mayer saw a film starring a Swedish actress, Greta Gustafsson. Greta Gustafsson would become Greta Garbo.
Garbo is a blank canvas, and we project our images of what we feel onto her. And that's part of the brilliance of her acting.
Garbo didn't have a bad angle, and she knew everything about lighting. And she was beyond categorizing. It was a truly great star.
On the set, Garbo was aloof and quietly demanding. But then, with Hollywood flair, fate took a hand.
When Garbo came to work on a John Gilbert film, which was Flesh and the Devil, no one expected that she would be the runaway sensation of that film. And they fell in love while they're making this film. And it was a passionate sexual affair, too. You had Garbo, who was a hot, cold person, mostly cold, and Gilbert, who was hot, hot, hot. And when there was hot from her and hot from him, great. But when it was cold from her, it drove him crazy.
In the 1927 film Love, an adaptation of the Russian novel Anna Karenina, the Garbo-Gilbert passion infused their performances. But off-screen, their affair was even more tempestuous.
There exist no photographs of Garbo between October 1926 and April 1927, which in the history of Hollywood is amazing and unique. So she was being hidden someplace, and the question is why? Was she pregnant? Was there an abortion? Was there domestic violence?
If there was something to hide, the movie moguls were learning to keep it hidden. With troops of studio publicists to manage the press and close relations with local police and politicians, Louis B. Mayer made sure that Garbo's mysterious allure was carefully maintained and protected. It was not an easy job. 1920s America sometimes seemed out of control. In films like Our Dancing Daughters, Joan Crawford played a new kind of American girl, the flapper, a woman in energetic revolt. And Louise Brooks' bobbed hair set the fashion. The innocent era of Mary Pickford was clearly over. No one embodied the times as emphatically as Clara Bow.
She was the first generation that grew up on the movies, and she would read the movie magazines and take them as literal truth and really believe that stardom could bring you happiness and contentment.
The winner of a Hollywood talent search when she was 16, Bow was given a bit part in a movie. She soon had bigger parts. Stars like Gloria Swanson were like royalty. Clara Bow was a Cinderella star. She had it.
It was an invention of a woman named Eleanor Glynn, who was a very shrewd self-promoter. She created this term it, and what it meant was anybody's guess, because you could never pin her down exactly what it meant. It was something that you had that was almost inexplicable, therefore the term it. But what it was drew everybody to you. And that's why Clara Bow was the one and only it girl. Clara Bow's love life was the object of much attention in the 1920s. What the public was hearing and reading and enjoying was this idea of a liberated woman who was in control. But it also meant that in the mores of the time, she was promiscuous.
At one time, Beau juggled the affections of director Victor Fleming and up-and-coming star Gary Cooper. 1920s audiences were equally enamored with Clara. To B.P. Schulberg, the head of production at Paramount, she was a hyperactive goldmine. Her films were cheap to produce and enormously profitable. The uncertainties of discovering a star like Clara Bow or spotting a good story made movie-making fast-paced and unpredictable. But a major source of Hollywood profits and power came from more than stars and stories.
The great founder of the movies was Adolf Zukor. He didn't go out and make a movie. He built theaters. Then once you had a batch of theaters, you got to put something in them. So it's largely a real estate business. How to get people to buy seats in the dark while flickering images, are on the screen in front of them.
Fox, Paramount, and Lowe's had the biggest theater chains, as the 1920s saw the full flowering of the movie palaces that had begun the decade before. In 1926, movie entrepreneurs spent nearly half their annual profits on new theaters.
They were meant to be places where you could go and escape the rest of your world and have a giant infusion of entertainment. I think the audience that went to movies in these gorgeous movie theaters did feel like they were going into a palace. They felt pampered, cared for. There were armies of ushers dressed in special uniforms that led them to their seats with flashlights. Everything you could do to treat them beautifully.
While owning theaters led to owning studios for many of the early moguls, it also influenced one of the silent era's most influential writers, Anita Luz. Her father had owned a San Diego Nickelodeon. Barely over 5 feet tall, Anita Luz was just out of her teens when she sold her first story to D.W. Griffith.
She exemplifies how you could get into the movie business by just kind of wanting to be in the movie business. And she also exemplifies the fact that a lot of the early screenwriters, as a matter of fact, about half of them, were women.
Luz's scripts helped launch the career of Douglas Fairbanks and added a witty edge to the image of the modern female, especially her novel, play, and film Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, where women acting dumb outsmarted men. Whether you were a woman or a man, you needed to be tough and determined to make it in Hollywood.
My father was born in Wahoo, Nebraska, about 1902. And he came from a very humble beginning. His father ran a small hotel there. He dropped out around the 6th or 7th grade. He really didn't have any formal education. And he joined the Army very, very young. He had braces that he knocked off, actually, because he thought that it was a giveaway to his age.
Darryl Zanuck may not have had a formal education, but he was good at telling stories. As a teenager, he became a struggling writer. In 1924, he was noticed by Jack Warner. At 21, Zanuck was hired as a Warner Brothers writer. His first star was a 4-footed wonder.
Rin Tin Tin was a dog. It was the brainchild of a man named Darryl Zanuck, or as my grandfather used to call him, 3 wonderful guys named Darryl Francis Zanuck. And he was the one who, I think, put Warner Brothers on the map as a production company.
My father wrote Rin Tin Tin stories as one of his early assignments at Warner Brothers. And he used to say, the only thing on this lot that's smarter than I am is Rin Tin Tin. Because he thought that Jack, who was his friend, was kind of a buffoon. And he was surrounded by buffoons, and nobody really wanted to work as hard as he was working.
Thanks to Rin Tin Tin and a lot of creative drive, Zanuck was named Warner Production Chief in 1927, a boy wonder like MGM's Irving Thalberg.
You would have to say no one that was meek or bashful could have possibly come from Wahoo, Nebraska, without a dime in his pocket and end up as Darryl Zanuck. But he did. And the circumstances were right. The timing of the industry, the birth of the industry was right. He was the right age, and he had the right energy, and he had the right talent. He was dynamic. You wouldn't want to be up against him in even a tic-tac-toe game.
Just as Darryl Zanuck was taking his first steps to becoming a movie mogul, Hollywood inadvertently acquired a typically grandiose advertisement for itself. In 1923, an enormous sign was erected in the hills overlooking the town. With 50-foot-high letters, it read Hollywoodland, promoting a real estate development. 20 years later, the sign was still there, with only Hollywood remaining. It became an accidental symbol of the movie capital and one of the world's most recognized landmarks. By 1927, even though the moguls and movie stars had nothing to do with a Hollywoodland sign, they were eager to promote the industry it would come to represent. The result would be the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. But at first, not everyone in Hollywood was ready to celebrate. Faced with increasing dissatisfaction about salaries and creative control among writers, directors, and actors, to the horror of the moguls, there was talk of unionism.
The Academy was actually organized because they were trying to keep the unions out of Hollywood, and the major studios thought, well, if we organize this academy where people have problems, they'll come to us, and we'll solve the problems and keep the unions out.
The first Academy Awards ceremony, held in the Blossom Room of the Hollywood Roosevelt Hotel, was an informal affair. In fact, everyone knew the winners beforehand, and not everyone took the honor seriously. For Best Actor, Jack Warner nominated Rin Tin Tin. Two films, a lyrical drama, Sunrise, and an aerial war epic, Wings, were both honored as Best Picture. Both showed how far silent storytelling had come since the days of the Great Train Robbery. Wings director was 31-year-old William Wellman, a maverick best known for hard-hitting melodramas and westerns.
My father was a rebel. He was born a rebel. He lived as a rebel. He always had trouble with authority figures. He was always looking to tomorrow. See, he was never a guy going about yesterday. Even today, maybe. But it's tomorrow. He's ready to go.
Typical of the varied backgrounds of early filmmakers, it was Wellman's experience as an actual fighter pilot in World War I that impressed Jesse Lasky at Paramount. Despite Lasky's enthusiasm, Adolf Zukor balked at the budget. But in the end, Wings showed the political power and influence the movie business wielded.
The War Department ended up giving Paramount what amounted to $16 million worth of manpower and equipment. They put together well over 5,000 troops, hundreds of pilots, hundreds of planes, tanks.
Even with the U.S. military to back them up, Zukor and Lasky knew they were taking a risk with such an expensive and action-oriented production. For insurance, as anxious producers would do time and again, they turned to star power. This time, bubbly Clara Bow. Bow added her non-stop energy to a raucous production environment. The survivor of more than a few brawls, William Wellman had earned his nickname Wild Bill. The huge success of Wings didn't make Adolf Zukor and Jesse Lasky any less annoyed with their maverick director.
They didn't invite him to the opening of Wings, and they made sure he was not invited to the first Academy Award celebration, and his picture won Best Picture.
In the years to come, the Academy Awards would continue to honor, celebrate, and often stir controversy. Representing creative tensions that were at the heart of Hollywood's mix of commerce and art, William Wellman would also continue his willful ways for more than 40 years. But for a founding generation of filmmakers, Wings was only one memorable film in a remarkable decade of Hollywood history. The great comedy stars, Chaplin, Lloyd, and Keaton were in a full bloom of fun. The swashbuckling adventures of Douglas Fairbanks amazed, Garbo intrigued, and Clara Bow delighted. At the same time, movie storytelling had matured and deepened. Inspired by the example of D.W. Griffith, directors like King Vidor explored contemporary America with films such as The Crowd, a visually evocative examination of the impact of a newly emerging mass culture. In hardly more than 20 years, an unlikely generation of entrepreneurs and image makers had created an international entertainment industry. Mass media idols had emerged, and an expressive new visual medium had been fully formed.
The great films that survive are so human, so deeply human, and so transcendently moving, because there's a certain simplicity, and yet it's very complex. Because finally a gesture would tell a great deal. I mean, it was all images.
D.W. Griffith and Max Sennett and Charlie Chaplin and other pioneers of silent film not only set a standard, a very high standard, but they also invented a lot of the filmmaking grammar and a lot of the storytelling techniques that remain absolutely intact today.
During the 1920s, movie storytelling reached a pinnacle of style and audience appeal. Studio output and profits were soaring. MGM boss Nick Schenck boasted, "We can make money showing blank film." Then, with little warning, Hollywood was inundated with change.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 50-50 Mississippi.
The movies were learning to talk, and audiences were eager to listen.